So we're going to talk about the role of the private sector in managing natural resources, and also about, in particular, about private sector-led initiatives to manage natural resources sustainably and responsibly. We're going to start in general terms talking about the various roles of the private sector in natural resource management, and then move on to more specific issues around how we're going to cover this in the report. What we mean by the private sector. There's lots of different kinds of players within that category. We're going to look at private sector-led natural resource management initiatives that exist, the incentives for them, and the impact of them. We're going to talk about the role of partnerships between the private sector and other stakeholders and policymakers, and how that can contribute to solutions. And finally, we'll talk about some of the policy implications that we think we're going to draw in the report. So just to start off with then, talking about the role of the private sector in natural resource management. Broadly speaking, you can conceive of the private sector as having two different roles here. One is as a consumer of natural resources. You know, the private sector uses natural resources in making products and services that it then sells to its customers. Another role is as a provider of natural resources, of access to energy or to water, etc. Now, this chapter, chapter 8, which is the one that we are leading in my team, Private Sector Markets team, is focusing on the first issue, examining private sector attempts to manage the natural resources that they use in producing goods and services. The second issue is obviously really important as well, but is more covered by the chapters on energy, land and water themselves, because when you talk about producing any of those natural resources, basically you're talking about private sector activity in most cases, and how you manage it is through public policy in most cases. So that's covered in those chapters and also in the public policy chapter. What we want to do in this chapter specifically is look at how the private sector manages natural resources itself, beyond what is required of it. For the kinds of issues we're talking about here, relating to environmental pollution, relating to depletion of natural resources, increasing scarcity, the price that they have to pay does not always reflect these other issues. They are externalities, they're not part of the price. And so what happens is that the private sector overuses these resources. So that's why there's an argument for a carbon price, so that the price of using fossil fuels, for example, goes up, and that will strengthen incentives for the private sector to avoid using fossil fuels. It will strengthen incentives for them to be energy efficient. And that's clearly where the role of policy and regulation comes in, to set the framework up in the right way so that the private sector operates in a way which is maximising global welfare, so to speak. But, having said all that, none of that is going to be the focus of Chapter 8, because as I've said, that's going to focus on what the private sector is doing itself to manage natural resources. And that's obviously related to a much bigger set of players in terms of all the private sector that's involved in producing all sorts of goods and services need to have access to natural resources going forward. And there are a number of reasons why they have to manage natural resources themselves, and may take the initiative, perhaps where public policy doesn't do it for them, to behave in a more responsible and sustainable way. But before we go any further, I just wanted to talk about what we mean by the private sector. Because clearly the private sector is a huge set of different kinds of bodies. It includes multinational corporations, it includes SMEs, it includes small farmers, micro-entrepreneurs. These can all be counted as private sector. We are largely going to focus on multinationals in Chapter 8, and that is because when you look at this issue of who is leading private sector initiatives to manage natural resources, it tends to be multinationals that are doing it, and that's because they are the ones, I guess, that have the resource, they have the ability, they have the incentive, perhaps, to be more proactive on these issues. And clearly what they do also has impact on other players, SMEs, etc., through their impact down the supply chain. And that's something we're going to examine in a lot more detail in the report. I'm going to hand over to Chris to talk a bit about that now.
Thank you, Karen. So while we were struggling to some extent in the last workshop about whether to focus on large-scale business or small-scale business, the two are not necessarily unrelated, and we can think of some circumstances where, for example, when they're operating in the same supply chain, that they're linked by the supply chain itself. So in this case, Castle lager produced by smallholders in Africa. And when smallholders are linked to large multinationals in supply chains, those standards, those corporate standards, the market regulations that the corporates are responding to, are passed back down to the small enterprise. Now, that's not necessarily a good thing, and this kind of introduces a conflict, if you like, a paradox between inclusiveness of growth and sustainability of growth. An example of that might be, for example, if the environmental regulations that the corporates are responding to cost the smallholder a great deal more in terms of production costs. We also grapple to some extent about who's more effective at managing natural resources. Is it the small guy or is it the big multinational? And I guess there are several sets of conflicting evidence about this. There's a lot of evidence in literature about the efficiency of small enterprise, small farms, for example. However, there are several examples, thinking perhaps of water use, thinking perhaps of the issues currently in the Horn of Africa over the use of rangelands, where the activities of large multinationals may even be marginal compared to the cumulative effects of small activities. Going back to the example in the Horn of Africa, pastoralism, inappropriate agronomic practices and deforestation, obviously causing enormous natural resource management issues as we speak. So something we'll be dealing with in Chapter 8 is looking for some evidence to see to what extent these ideas are generalizable, to what extent are small-scale businesses, large-scale businesses good at managing natural resources. And while, as Karen said, most of the chapter will focus on the large scale, on the multinationals, we're going to dwell for a little while on the small guy, and specifically we're going to look at the role of small producers and small enterprises in managing common pool resources. So, for example, in this slide we see mangroves, fisheries, water and forests. Again, if you look at the evidence, there are a number of factors that determine how well the groups of small enterprises manage natural resources. Examples are the size of the resource, whether or not the resource is well defined, how mobile the resource is, and within the group itself, how good the quality of leadership is, how large the group is, again, whether the group boundaries are well defined, the cost of regulating access to the resource, and the cost of the technology required to access the resource. So we will look in some degree at the activities of small enterprises in relation to common pool resources. So moving back to the main focus of this Chapter 8, which is the multinational, and thinking about some of the things that multinationals do within their own companies to manage natural resources and to measure the way they're impacting natural resources. So, for example, Thomas Cook, part of the TUI travel conglomerate, is part of the Travel Life initiative, which awards gold, silver or bronze standards to hotels and airlines depending on their environmental performance, and this is something that they can use as a marketing tool. Danone, Unilever and Nestlé are collaborating in the Sustainable Agriculture Initiative, which looks at social, environmental and economic aspects of sustainable agriculture. Marks and Spencer's have Plan A, which includes a whole range of environmental impact indicators. Coca-Cola are running their water stewardship program, looking at reducing their use of water, recycling wastewater and replenishing water in local communities. And Starbucks are running the Cafe Practices Certification Scheme, which includes an environmental leadership component, which was designed with a third-party auditing firm and Conservation International again looking at social, environmental and economic aspects of environmental management on coffee farms. Externally, corporates can subscribe to a number of impact monitoring schemes. This is an example of 3 of the most common, the largest being the UN Global Compact. Then there's the Global Reporting Initiative, which is often used in conjunction with internal schemes. And then the B certified corporation, which includes a life cycle auditing of various products. So there's 3 examples of initiatives external to companies. I'm thinking to some extent about George's talk and what private sector investment actually means for inclusive and sustainable growth at the water, energy and land nexus. We've heard today a great deal about how green growth is at the forefront of everyone's thinking at the moment, including investment in hydropower. Our neighbouring country here, Tanzania, has invested heavily in hydropower. That's not without its problems. People who are familiar with Tanzania will know that due to the issues with rainfall these days, unpredictable rainfall, small and medium enterprises are really suffering in terms of growth. There's electricity shortage most of the time in Tanzanian cities, which clearly on a certainly a micro and a medium level has real implications for the country's growth. We've heard about how an important part of investment in land, whether you want to call it land acquisition, land grabs, is related to biofuels. This picture is of jatropha products. Again, potential for economic growth, for employment, growth of SMEs, but again, not without its problems. In terms of land equity, we've heard as well about potential impacts on food security and food markets. In terms of water, the Greater Mekong sub-region in Southeast Asia is an enormous producer of farmed fish. It's an enormous employer, a huge foreign earnings, huge in terms of foreign earnings. However, in terms of the water resource itself, to produce these fish intensively causes a lot of pollution, a lot of natural resource management issues, and there's real issues with sustainability of the feedstock. So this is a picture of catfish in the Mekong Delta in Vietnam, and these things are actually fed other fish, which clearly has real implications in terms of other livelihoods. And forestry has been mentioned in George's talk about one of the investment opportunities in developing countries in forestry, one of the competing activities on land. Clearly, again, especially in the short term, logging is an earner of foreign income, but real issues in terms of loss of biodiversity, in terms of land degradation. So I'll now hand over to Karen, who will finish off with some ideas about the incentives for sustainable natural resource management by corporates.
Thanks, Chris. Last 2 slides. Obviously, what we're really interested in here is the impact of these kinds of initiatives. What we want to be able to answer is the extent to which the private sector can be relied upon to solve these problems itself. So how well do these kinds of initiatives really work? And in fact, the evidence out there is very thin indeed. It seems that very few of these initiatives have inbuilt monitoring mechanisms. Many don't even specify targets. Some do. And some do provide for monitoring against those targets, but many don't. So there's a question mark about how many of these initiatives are really having a concrete impact on how the business does business, rather than just being about good PR. And that's something we want to examine further. And we've commissioned 2, or about to commission 2 background papers to this effect. One from John Elkington, who is a big name on corporate sustainability in the UK, which will look at the overall sort of trends in terms of the sustainability agenda amongst corporates and the effectiveness of that and how that's evolving over time and what the new ideas are on that. And a second one looking at the water, how business manages water. And it's looking at a variety of different sectors, industries, to look at the extent to which they are making an effort not only to be water efficient in the way that they operate, but also to collaborate with others, other businesses, and also with government to manage a problem at a national or regional or geographical level in some way in order to maintain the sustainability of their own business model going forward. So they're the two pieces of work we've commissioned to feed into this question. We're also going to look at the role of partnerships. We're going to look at this question that Dirk raised about Rio Plus 10 partnerships. There's a whole load of partnerships we're signed up to then, and we're going to see what's happened as a result of those partnerships to see if there's any conclusions we can draw that we can feed into Rio Plus 20. And we're also going to try and draw some implications for policy. And here it's more about policy that facilitates private sector solutions. So it's about whether policy can help to coordinate or bring together the private sector to achieve some of these things, whether by helping to monitor private sector initiatives that can help to strengthen them. So a whole range of ways that either the public policy or other stakeholders can contribute to private sector solutions. Of course, the biggest incentive may be increasing scarcity itself, which may drive up prices so much that the private sector really has to solve it, particularly if there's a failure of governance, if there's a failure of policy to tackle these issues. Then the private sector, in the longer term at least, may be forced to try and tackle the problem itself. So it'll be interesting to see how, whether the public sector can respond to that increasing challenge. In the breakout groups later, we'd like to talk about this issue in more depth, to ask, to what extent do you think the private sector is managing the problem itself? To what extent do you think we need public policy to step in to create incentives for private sector to operate more sustainably and more responsibly? And what do you think is the role of partnerships in helping to achieve those kinds of solutions? Okay, that's it. Thank you.